I never thought I would see the day when my whole family sat in silence because of me. For years, I was the child no one noticed. At family dinners, I was the shadow in the corner, while my cousins shined like stars. My grandparents made it clear. I was nothing compared to them. But that all changed at the will reading. The lawyer looked around the room, read the last lines, and suddenly, everything, every house, every penny, every piece of land, was mine. The cousins who used to laugh at me were frozen in shock. Before I tell you how all of this happened, make sure you subscribe. I share shocking stories of betrayal, revenge, and family drama every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Growing up, I never thought I mattered. My cousins were the golden children. The grandparents gave them new bikes, shiny clothes, expensive toys, even money on their birthdays. I, on the other hand, barely got a smile. Sometimes I got nothing at all. I remember once when I turned 12, I sat quietly as my cousins opened gift after gift. When it was my turn, my grandmother handed me a pen and said, "Maybe one day you'll write something useful with this." Everyone laughed. I forced a smile, but inside, I was crushed. Moments like that became normal. My cousins were praised for even the smallest things, while my own efforts were ignored. Every family gathering felt like a reminder that I was invisible. What I didn't know then was that all those painful memories were preparing me for the day when everything would flip upside down. From the time I could remember, favoritism was the air I breathed in my family. It wasn't hidden, and it wasn't subtle. My grandparents never even tried to treat us all the same. To them, my cousins were perfect little angels, while I was just there. I remember being very small, maybe 5 or 6, when I first noticed it. My cousins would come running into the living room with new toys. My grandmother's face would light up as she said, "Look at my smart boys. Look how handsome they are." She would hug them tight, her voice filled with love. Then she would look at me sitting quietly in the corner, and her smile would fade. "You should learn from them," she would say. That was all. No hug, no praise, no love. As I grew older, the gap only became clearer. On birthdays, the cousins had parties with balloons, music, and piles of gifts. I was always invited, of course, but I was never the star. I still remember one year when my cousin turned 10. He got a shiny red bicycle with his name painted on it. Everyone clapped and cheered as he rode it across the yard. When I turned 10 the next month, I got nothing. My grandmother just said, "Well, at least you are healthy. That should be enough." The room was quiet and I felt heat rising in my face. I laughed it off, but inside it hurt more than I could explain. School life wasn't much different. My grandparents bragged about my cousin's grades, even when they weren't that great. If my cousin passed with a C, they said, "At least he is trying, he is a bright boy." But when I came home with an A, there was no celebration. Sometimes they even said, "Don't get proud, one grade doesn't mean you are better." No matter what I did, it was never enough. At family dinners, favoritism was displayed like a show. My grandparents would sit at the head of the table. They always asked my cousins about their sports, their friends, their plans. My cousins talked loudly, joking, laughing, enjoying the attention. When it was my turn to speak, my grandmother would change the subject or worse, remind me of something embarrassing. Once I shared that, I got top marks in a science test. Instead of congratulating me, she chuckled and said, "Maybe you should go teach your cousin because he doesn't care about science." The whole table laughed. My cousins smirked, and I felt small, like my achievements were a joke. The difference in gifts was like night and day. When my cousins graduated from middle school, they got watches, cash, even laptops. When I graduated, my grandfather patted my shoulder and said, "Good job, keep working." That was it. No gift, no recognition. I smiled, but inside I felt hollow. My cousins also loved to rub their special treatment in my face. They knew the grandparents loved them more, and they used it as power. They would tease me, saying things like, "Don't worry, when Grandpa dies, all of this will be ours." Anyway, I would keep quiet, but every word cut deep. Sometimes I wanted to shout back, but I knew it would only make me look bitter. One memory still burns in me. It was Christmas. The house smelled of roasted chicken, and the tree was bright with lights. The living room was packed with gifts for my cousins, boxes stacked so high they almost touched the branches. My pile had only two small boxes. One had socks, the other had a notebook. My grandmother smiled and said, "Now you can keep track of your thoughts. It will help you one day." She said it as if it were a gift of wisdom. I nodded, but in my heart I wondered why I was never worth more. This favoritism shaped me. At first, it made me sad. I cried in private many nights, wondering why I wasn't lovable enough. Was I ugly? Was I stupid? Did I do something wrong? But slowly, over time, that sadness turned into determination. I realized I couldn't make them love me the way they loved my cousins. But maybe I could make myself strong enough to stand without their love. While my cousins were spoiled with gifts, I found comfort in books. I would spend hours reading, studying, learning. I knew I had to prove my worth, not to them, but to myself. My grandparents' words hurt, but they also fueled me. Every time they ignored my success, I told myself, one day I'll be so far ahead they won't be able to ignore me. The favoritism never stopped, but my reaction changed. I no longer expected their approval. Instead, I watched as my cousins grew more arrogant. They bragged about money they didn't earn, about gifts they didn't deserve. They mocked me, but I stayed quiet, holding on to the one thing they didn't have: discipline. Looking back, I now see the irony. The very favoritism that was meant to push me down ended up lifting me higher. The gifts that spoiled my cousins became the chains that held them back, and the neglect that hurt me so deeply became the fire that pushed me forward. At the time, though, I didn't see it. I only felt the pain of being unwanted, forgotten, invisible. But little did I know, every ignored birthday, every insult, every empty holiday was building up to a moment where all the tables would turn. As I got older, the favoritism did not fade. In fact, it became stronger. By the time I was a teenager, the gap between me and my cousins was like a wide river. They were living on one side with praise, money, and comfort. I was standing alone on the other side, with silence and empty hands. My cousins grew up spoiled. They had everything given to them without working for it. If they wanted new shoes, my grandparents bought them the most expensive brand. If they wanted a phone, they got the latest model, even before most adults in the family had one. When they turned 16, each of them got their own car. They would drive around, showing it off, laughing loudly when they passed by me walking home from school. I never got a car. I walked, or I saved my pocket money to buy cheap bus tickets. At first it hurt. I wondered why life seemed so unfair. But then, slowly, I started to see something important. My cousins had everything handed to them, so they never worked for anything. They thought the world would always give them what they wanted. I, on the other hand, had nothing. So I learned to work hard. I studied late into the night, I helped around the house, and I even did small jobs to save money. The difference between us was becoming clear, though none of them could see it yet. School was another battlefield. My cousins weren't interested in grades. They skipped homework, copied answers, or bribed teachers with charm. When they failed, my grandparents defended them, saying, "Not everyone is good at school. They are still special." When I worked hard and succeeded, my grandparents brushed it off, saying, "Good, that's expected of you." It never felt like praise, only a reminder that even my best was seen as ordinary. Still, I kept going. I realized something. Every time my grandparents ignored my achievements, they were training me to stand on my own. I didn't need applause anymore. I worked for myself. I worked for my future. The cousins, however, became arrogant. They teased me constantly. They would laugh at my old clothes, my secondhand books, or my simple shoes. "Why try so hard?" they said. "In the end, Grandpa and Grandma will give it all to us anyway." Their words cut deep, but I stayed silent. Deep inside, I thought, maybe they're right. Maybe nothing I do will matter. But another voice inside me whispered, "Keep going. Don't stop." One day, this will change. One incident during high school burned itself into my memory. It was at a family dinner. The table was full of food and everyone was laughing. My cousins were bragging about how they skipped class and still passed their exams because teachers like them. My grandfather chuckled and called them clever. I mentioned quietly that I had just won a science fair. I had worked on the project for months, building a small robot that could pick up objects. I was proud of it. But instead of clapping, my grandmother shook her head. Science is useless. Why don't you spend time making friends like your cousins? You are always too serious. The room went quiet for a moment, then everyone laughed. I laughed too, but my chest burned. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and promised myself, one day they will regret these words. College years made the difference between us even bigger. My cousins partied, spent money, and failed classes. They wasted opportunities because they thought everything would be waiting for them anyway. I worked harder than ever. I took extra classes, worked part-time jobs, and studied until my eyes hurt. I didn't do it for my grandparents' approval anymore. I did it because I wanted to build a future that no one could take away. There were times I almost gave up. Watching my cousins live such easy lives while I struggled was painful. They traveled, went to parties, and posted pictures of their fun. I was stuck in the library or working late shifts. Sometimes I asked myself, why am I the only one suffering? But then I remembered the pen and notebook my grandmother had once given me, saying, maybe you'll write something useful with this. I took those words as a challenge. If they thought I would never amount to anything, I would prove them wrong. The more spoiled my cousins became, the more blind my grandparents grew. They refused to see their failures. Even when one cousin got arrested for drunk driving, my grandparents defended him. He is young. Boys make mistakes. But when I missed one family dinner because I had an exam the next morning, my grandmother scolded me for being ungrateful. The unfairness was heavy, but instead of breaking me, it made me stronger. It was during these years that my mind changed. I realized my grandparents' favoritism was actually a gift in disguise. By ignoring me, they forced me to depend on myself. By praising my cousins no matter what, they turned them into weak and lazy adults. It was like watching two roads. Theirs was shiny and easy at the start, but full of traps ahead. Mine was dark and lonely, but it was leading somewhere greater. Remember writing in that notebook one night, one day I'll walk into a room and they won't be able to ignore me anymore. I didn't know how or when, but I held on to that thought like a secret weapon. Years passed and my cousins only grew worse. They wasted their money, failed in school, and depended on the grandparents for everything. I kept climbing quietly, step by step. No one noticed me, no one cared. But that was fine, because when the time came, I would be ready. And that time came sooner than I thought. When the grandparents began to grow old and sick, and whispers of the will spread through the family, time has a way of changing people, even the strongest ones. My grandparents, who once walked with pride and commanded every room, began to grow weaker. Their hair turned white, their steps slowed, and their voices grew softer. But one thing did not change: their favoritism. Even in old age, they clung to my cousins as if they were treasures, and I remained the shadow in the background. When my grandmother fell sick, the cousins took turns visiting her, but not out of love. They would sit by her side with fake smiles, pretending to care, while their eyes wandered to the jewelry box on the dresser. My grandfather's health was failing too, and I could hear the whispers starting around the family. What will happen to all their money? Who will get the house? Who will inherit the land? It wasn't really a secret. Everyone believed the cousins would get everything. My aunts and uncles even joked about it. Of course the boys will inherit. They've always been grandma's favorites. Sometimes they would say this right in front of me, as if I didn't exist. I just sat quietly, pretending it didn't bother me. But deep down, the words cut like knives. The cousins themselves became bolder. They bragged openly about what they would do with the inheritance. One cousin said he would sell the old family house and buy himself a sports car. Another said he would quit college because, why study when Grandpa's money will take care of me forever? They laughed as if the future was already written in their names. I stayed silent. On the outside, I didn't argue or fight. But inside, I was watching closely. I noticed their laziness, their arrogance, and their carelessness. I also knew something. They didn't. I had kept my grades high, I had no scandals, and I had worked harder than any of them. If there was even the smallest chance the will had conditions, I was ready. Still, the thought of the will haunted me. I tried to prepare myself for disappointment. After all, favoritism had ruled my life from the start. Why would death change anything? In my heart, I believed the cousins would get it all, and I would be left with nothing but memories of rejection. When my grandmother passed away, the family gathered in grief, but it felt different. Some cried, but others seemed more focused on what she had left behind. The cousins wore black suits and sad faces, but I could see the excitement in their eyes. My grandfather followed her a few months later, and that's when the real storm began. The day after the funeral, whispers became louder. The lawyer will read the will soon. It must all be for the boys. My cousins smirked, already arguing about who would take which car, who would move into which property. They looked at me once and said, half joking but half serious, "Don't worry, maybe they left you something small, like an old book or a chair." They laughed, and I forced a smile. Inside, though, I felt a strange calm. Maybe it was because I had spent my whole life expecting nothing. Or maybe it was because, deep down, I sensed that life had been preparing me for this exact moment. When the day of the will reading finally came, my heart pounded in my chest. The family lawyer called us into a quiet office, and we all sat down. The cousins looked smug, leaning back in their chairs as if the world already belonged to them. I sat quietly, hands folded, waiting to hear the final verdict of a lifetime of favoritism, and then the lawyer began to speak. The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffled a few papers, and adjusted his glasses. The room was silent except for the sound of my cousins whispering to each other and trying to hide their excited smiles. I could almost hear their thoughts. "This is it. Everything is ours." He started reading slowly. "We, being of sound mind, do hereby leave our possessions." My cousins leaned forward, holding their breath. My hands were shaking under the table. The first few lines made it sound exactly as everyone expected. The lawyer listed the family house, the land, the jewelry, the savings. Each item, one by one, seemed to point directly to my cousins. My stomach dropped. It felt like all the years of humiliation were repeating themselves again in this moment. I told myself not to cry, not to show weakness. I kept my eyes down, waiting for the words that would confirm I had been left out. My cousins, meanwhile, were grinning wider and wider. One nudged the other and whispered, "Told you so." Their parents smiled too, proud that their children would now be the heirs. For a moment, I thought it was over. That I was about to leave the room empty-handed, invisible once again. But then, the lawyer paused. He looked up over his glasses, glanced at the cousins, then at me. His voice grew sharper as he continued. "However, these inheritances come with conditions." The room froze. My cousins' smiles faded. They sat up straighter. "What conditions?" one of them muttered. The lawyer read on. "The beneficiaries must complete a college degree with honors, must maintain a record of discipline and responsibility, and must be able to show proof of steady progress in their lives. If these conditions are not met, the inheritance will not be given to them." I could feel my heartbeat racing. College degree with honors, discipline, responsibility. I had all of that. I had worked my entire life for exactly those things. My cousins didn't. The lawyer added, "Should the primary beneficiaries fail to meet these conditions, the inheritance will be transferred to the alternate beneficiary named in this will." He stopped, looked at the paper, and then looked directly at me. "That beneficiary is Emily." For a few seconds, no one breathed. The cousins blinked in shock, their mouths hanging open. Their parents started murmuring nervously. And I sat frozen, my mind spinning. Did I hear that right? Me? After everything? One cousin slammed his hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. Grandpa and Grandma never said anything about conditions. They promised it all to us. The lawyer stayed calm. I can only read what is written here. The will is clear. Conditions must be proven. If you cannot provide proof of your graduation, your discipline, your stability, you do not qualify. The room erupted into chaos. My cousin started shouting. One yelled that he had almost graduated, another claimed that grades didn't matter, and a third said the conditions were unfair. Their voices overlapped, sharp and angry. The lawyer raised his hand and said firmly, "The documents and records will be checked. Until then, no one receives anything." I sat quietly, but inside I felt something powerful rising. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. My name had been spoken out loud, in a way that gave me power. I didn't smile, I didn't laugh, but my heart whispered, "This is it. This is my moment." The cousins glared at me. "You think you're better than us?" One spat. Another sneered, "Don't get too happy. You'll never get it. They left it all for us, not you." I stayed calm. I didn't need to argue. The truth was in the paper, and soon it would be in the records too. For the first time, the favoritism that had crushed me my whole life no longer mattered. What mattered was the truth, the hard work I had done in silence while they wasted their lives. The lawyer ended the reading with one final line. "If the primary beneficiaries fail, the inheritance transfers fully to Emily, without exception." The room was quiet again, but this time the silence was heavy, filled with anger, fear, and disbelief. My cousins' faces were pale. Their parents avoided my eyes. And me? I sat there, calm on the outside, but inside I felt the beginning of a storm that was about to change everything. After the will reading, my cousins acted as if nothing had changed. They were sure the lawyer had made a mistake, or that somehow the conditions didn't apply to them. Grandpa loved us. Of course, he wanted us to have everything, they said again and again. Their arrogance didn't fade. It grew stronger. The first cousin, the one who bragged about buying a sports car, barely showed up to his college classes. He was always busy partying, wasting money, or sleeping until noon. When the lawyer asked him for proof of his degree with honors, he couldn't provide anything. He hadn't even finished half his courses. The second cousin was worse. He dropped out of school completely, saying he didn't need an education because money was already mine. He spent his time posting pictures on social media, showing off expensive watches and trips he paid for with credit cards. When the lawyer requested proof of his discipline and steady progress, he had nothing but debts and excuses. The third cousin thought he was smarter than everyone. He tried to forge documents, pretending he had graduated with high marks. But the lawyer checked the university records, and the truth came out. He had failed most of his classes. His fake confidence crumbled in seconds. I watched all of this, quietly, almost in disbelief. These were the same cousins who once sat on golden thrones in the family, spoiled with gifts and praise while I was ignored. Now, one by one, their masks were falling. The gifts that had spoiled them became their curse. They had grown up expecting life to hand them everything, but when it finally mattered, they had nothing to show. Their parents begged the lawyer to make exceptions. "They're still young," they argued. "They'll do better later." But the will was clear. No conditions met meant no inheritance. The cousins grew desperate. They turned their anger toward me. "This is your fault," one shouted. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" Another threatened to fight me for the inheritance, as if fists could change legal documents. Their parents glared at me with hatred, as though I had stolen what was rightfully theirs. But deep inside, I didn't feel guilt. I felt justice. For years, I had lived in their shadows, hearing the cruel jokes, enduring the humiliation, being treated as less than nothing. I had studied quietly while they wasted their lives. I had been disciplined while they drowned in greed. I hadn't planned for this revenge, but life had written it for me. One by one, the lawyer crossed their names off the list. No degree, no honors, no discipline, no inheritance. By the time it was over, the truth was undeniable. The spoiled cousins had lost everything. And in their loss, I saw the clearest proof that favoritism had blinded my grandparents. They had chosen the wrong heirs. For the first time, the scales had finally balanced. When the final decision was announced, the room felt like it had lost all its air. The lawyer's voice was calm but firm. Since none of the primary beneficiaries have met the conditions, the full inheritance will pass to the alternate beneficiary, Emily. For a moment, no one spoke. My cousins sat frozen, their faces red with anger and pale with shock at the same time. Their parents stared at me as if they had just seen a stranger. The people who had mocked me, ignored me, and treated me like I didn't belong were now forced to watch as everything they believed was theirs slipped away. I didn't smile. I didn't laugh. I just sat there, trying to process what had happened. My whole life I had been invisible. Now suddenly, the spotlight was on me. The lawyer handed me the papers. Properties, bank accounts, land, all listed under my name. My hands trembled as I held them. Not because I cared so much about the money, but because of what it meant. It meant that all the years of being cast aside hadn't been for nothing. It meant that my grandparents, whether they realized it or not, had given me the chance to prove my worth. And I had. The cousins couldn't handle it. One stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Another started crying, blaming everyone but himself. The third sat in silence, staring at the table, his pride shattered. Their parents tried to argue, but the lawyer shut them down. The will is final. Nothing can change it. As I left that office, papers in hand, I felt a strange peace settle over me. The inheritance was mine, yes, but the real victory was deeper. For years, I had lived under the weight of favoritism and rejection. That day, I walked out free. When I got home, I looked around my small room, the same room I had studied, cried in, and dreamed in while my cousins lived like royalty. I smiled for the first time in years, not because of the wealth, but because justice had finally been served. The spoiled cousins had wasted their chances. I had earned mine, and in the end, the very gifts that ruined them became the door that opened my future. Looking back now, I realized something important. The inheritance was never just about money or land or property. It was about justice. It was about proving that hard work, patience, and resilience matter more than favoritism and empty praise. For years, I thought I was cursed to live in the shadows of my cousins. I thought I would always be the forgotten one, the one left behind. But in the end, life gave me the chance to rise above. My grandparents may have spoiled my cousins with gifts, but those gifts blinded them. They became careless, arrogant, and weak. I, on the other hand, grew strong in silence. When the will transferred everything to me, it wasn't just an inheritance. It was a lesson. A lesson that the world may seem unfair for a time, but sooner or later, truth finds its way. The spoiled cousins lost it all, and I gained more than I ever expected. Today, when I walk into the old family house that is now mine, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel freedom. I feel a sense of victory that doesn't come from money, but from knowing I survived, endured, and finally triumphed. And to anyone listening who has ever felt invisible, ignored, or unwanted, I want to tell you this: your story isn't over. Sometimes life saves the sweetest revenge for last. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe for more shocking family betrayals, dramatic twists, and unforgettable revenge stories. Your support helps me share even more. Until next time, remember, karma never forgets.